Clay class, now we are headed into a new section called pulmonary ventilation, and discussing the ramifications of really how we breathe and how it all works. Right, before we get into pulmonary ventilation, we kind of need to understand air pressure. This is we're going to talk about air pressure. We're going to talk about some common air pressure terms. If you remember if you've taken chemistry, physics, some of the stuff may look familiar. Okay, but before we get into all of that, we have two basic terms that we use for breathing: inspiration and expiration. Inspiration, breathing air into the lungs. Expiration, breathing air out of the lungs. And there is really nothing else you can do, besides breathe in and breathe out. Inspiration, breathe in; expiration, breathe out. Air moving in, air moving out. There is holding your breath. I guess you can temporarily hold your breath. I don't recommend that. You don't last very long holding your breath. Just to put things into perspective, you can go, I think you can go over a week without food, and still live. You can go about, I think they said 3 hours. Not 3 hours, 3 days without water. I think it's 3 days. I think that's what they say, roughly. And it's a little bit different per person. But you can only go minutes without breathing. If you hold your breath, or if you were drowning, for instance, and you couldn't breathe for too long, you would not last very long. So that's, just putting in perspective how very important breathing in and breathing out is for our bodies. All right, we're going to talk about pressure, which is a volume relationship, which provides force for pulmonary ventilation. We're going to talk about, everybody kind of knows pressure, the force that something applies, pressure. We're talking about air, a mixture of gas molecules. In the air that we breathe, we have nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, carbon dioxide, which is carbon plus oxygen. Nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide. All right, we have all those floating around, and some other things floating around in the air that we breathe. All right. Gas molecules in general move from an area of high pressure to low pressure, just like fluids. We talked about before, a beaker. If you poke a hole, if you have a beaker full of water and you were to poke a hole in that beaker, that fluid would flow out. Same sort of idea exists for gases. Gases go from high pressure, then they move to a low pressure. Okay? So it's something to remember. All right, pressure volume relationship, and we're going to talk about a couple different laws: Boyle's law, Dalton's law, a couple different laws in this section. Boyle's law describes the relationship between pressure and volume. As volume of a container increases, the pressure that gas exerts in the container decreases. And you can look at this syringe. There's a certain amount of gas in this syringe. If I cap the end of it and I increase the volume, if I pull up, increase the volume, the pressure of that gas, if you take the same amount of gas and spread it out over a bigger volume, the pressure that gas is exerting on the walls of that container will go down, and vice versa. As volume of the container decreases, if I push down on the plunger of that syringe and decrease the volume, decrease the space that gas has in that container, the pressure will go up. That's Boyle's law. So pressure and volume are inversely related. Volume increases, pressure decreases. Volume decreases, the pressure increases. All right, very simply put. All right, so how does that apply? Now we're going to talk about how that applies to the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation, inspiration and expiration, or otherwise known as breathing, involves changes in the thoracic cavity and lungs that lead to the creation of pressure gradient. Remember, just right off the bat, remember your lungs are not muscular per se, right? They're not muscles. And we're going to see that a little bit later on. But the idea is that we use our chest, we use our diaphragm to increase the volume, decrease the pressure, and to decrease the volume, increase the pressure, and that's how we breathe. So increase volume, decrease pressure, breathe in, pressure goes from high outside to low inside. Remember, pressure goes from high to low. My chest cavity compresses, decrease the volume, higher pressure inside my lungs, lower pressure outside my lungs, so air is forced out. That's basically the idea, right? So we're going to obviously go through the slides, but that's the basic idea that we want you to get, okay? So it involves this pressure gradient. Gradient causes air to move into or out of lungs, right? Very similar. All right, so some of the things we need to know to understand that concept in further detail is atmospheric pressure. That's going to be the pressure of the air around us, atmospheric pressure, which can change. The atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. That's how we measure it at sea level. As you go higher up into like the mountains, that atmospheric pressure goes lower. It decreases, right? So that's the pressure of all the air, all the different gases that are floating around us, right? So when you feel like, life is weighing you down, like life is on your shoulders and it feels like, it's just so heavy and I just wish life would, it's actually you actually do have atmospheric pressure weighing you down. Just being a little science humor. All right, so, it's due to gravity pulling on the air around us, okay? You also have what we call intrapulmonary pressure, air pressure within the alveoli, intrapulmonary pressure. And this changes based on inspiration and expiration, breathing in and breathing out. And it always eventually equalizes with atmospheric pressure, right? So we have those two pressures. We have the pressure outside, atmospheric pressure inside, intrapulmonary pressure. And then you have an intrapleural pressure found within the pleural cavity, all right? And this is similar to intrapulmonary. It's a little bit different. It also rises and falls with inspiration, expiration, but it does not equalize with atmospheric pressure, usually about 4 millimeters of mercury, just a little bit less than intrapulmonary pressure. And there's a specific reason for that, because it creates because it's a little bit lower than the pressure inside the lungs, it creates this suction effect, sort of pulls the lungs against the chest wall so that the lungs don't collapse. That's your intrapleural pressure, right? Intrapleural pressure. So intrapulmonary pressure, intrapleural pressure, and then you also have this atmospheric pressure. Pleural fluid is constantly pumped out of pleural cavity into lymphatic vessels, creates this slight vacuum which glues membranes together. Remember, like I said, the lungs do not have their own muscles. They're connected to the chest cavity, to the diaphragm, which do have muscles, which can, pull the lungs and make them create more volume, or compress and make them have less volume. All right, so how does it all work together? Let's discuss that. All right, so we start off with, this is broken down into just a couple steps. All right, step one, lungs at rest. So, sometimes if you actually go through the motions, it kind of helps you to understand how this actually all works out. All right, so take a big breath in, breath out. Your breath out, that's where step one is. All right, after you breathe out and about to breathe in, right? Lungs at rest between breaths. What is happening? Intrapulmonary, the pressure inside your alveoli, is same as atmospheric pressure. 760 millimeters of mercury. So pressure, once you breathe out, the pressure outside your body and the pressure inside your body is the same, right? So what does that mean? That means there's no airflow, right? Gases flow from high pressure to low pressure, right? So intrapleural pressure is still at 4 millimeters of mercury below atmospheric, which helps your lungs stay connected to your rib cage and your diaphragm. All right, step 2, we're about to breathe in. So you breathe out. Now you're equal with atmospheric pressure. Now you're about to breathe in. What happens? We expand. Expand, what happens? All right, for inspiration to occur, intrapulmonary pressure must be less than atmospheric pressure. For you to breathe in, the pressure in your lungs must be less than the pressure in the atmosphere. So what do? We increase the volume of our lungs, decreases intrapulmonary pressure to about 758 millimeters of mercury. As that air pressure decreases, air moves into your lungs, but at the same time, your intrapulmonary pressure, intrapleural pressure still remains lower so that your lungs stay connected to your rib cage. All right, so we're breathing in. Air will continue to move into the lungs until gradient no longer exists. All right, so eventually we breathe enough air in to where the pressures equal. Now the pressure inside and the pressure outside are the same. We've expanded our lungs, but we've also brought more air in, which increases the pressure, and eventually the pressures balance out again. Okay, now we have we stop and have no movement again. Now for air to move out of, that's step 3. Now for air to move out of your lungs, step 4, move this slide, move my picture a little bit. What we have to have is intrapulmonary pressure rises above atmospheric pressure, right? So we create pressure, start decreasing the volume, it increases the pressure inside your lungs, you breathe out. Good points to notice is that the lungs do not fully deflate, right? Because of the slight suction effect of the intrapleural pressure. Remember, they have to stay connected to your ribs and your diaphragm, which those forces oppose lungs' elastic recoil, keep lungs inflated. Expiration stops when intrapulmonary pressure equals atmospheric pressure. So pressure in your lungs when your rib cage and your diaphragm comes up, your rib cage condenses, we create pressure on the lungs, it rises, the pressure inside rises to 762 millimeters of mercury. So pressure outside, it stays the same, still 760. We push air out of our lungs. That's breathing out. So that's how pressure and breathing work together. And this is a diagram, a picture. It just shows you the differences. Go through this on your own, and you can see that. And this happens over and over and over every time you breathe. So what happens if intrapleural pressure increases to a level at or above atmospheric pressure? If intrapleural pressure no longer exerts suction effect, the lungs would collapse. And this can happen for a number of reasons. One of those being fluid on the lungs. Another one, remember that intrapleural pressure needs to stay a little bit less than the than the pressure inside your alveoli. All right, so if that difference doesn't happen, if that pressure rises too high, your lungs will collapse, which would be a terrible thing. Another way that it can happen besides fluid on your lungs is if you have a puncture. Remember, if I had like a stab wound, which it shows on the next slide, air from the outside and the inside, the pressures would equalize, and therefore my lungs would also collapse that way. And this is showing you a picture of that as well, that happening. All right, so that's another potential cause of lung collapse. All right, so that would not be good. All right, some mechanics of inspiration and expiration. We talked about creating the different pressures. I mentioned it a little bit. Lungs are not muscles. Lungs cannot change volume on their own, but it is the skeletal muscles of the thoracic cavity that make this happen. Okay, the muscles sort of around the lungs allow this to happen. All right, so your parietal pleura attaches to inner surface of thoracic cavity. Like I said, your lungs are attached to your inside of your rib cage and your diaphragm. As thoracic cavity expands, it pulls on the parietal pleura, pulls on the visceral pleura, and pulls lungs outward, increasing their volume. You breathe in. Diaphragm also, your diaphragm, remember your lungs rest on your diaphragm. It's the main inspiratory muscle. When people, those of you who are singers, I'm not a singer. I got kicked out of gospel choir when I was in high school, and no shame in my game. It just wasn't my calling. But I can teach anatomy and physiology, though. At least I think I can. But they say, I think they say that, like, breathe from your diaphragm, not from just your throat. I think that's what they tell you to do. I could never do it, but you do use your diaphragm when you breathe. This is the main. Notice it says inspiratory. We'll talk about that. It's dome shaped when relaxed, so it's actually curved up. It pushes up on your lungs when it's relaxed. And bulges up into the thoracic cavity, pulls down and becomes flat as you breathe. It actually, your diaphragm pulls down, so pulls down and expands the space that your lungs are in. You also have external intercostals. Those are the muscles between your rib cage, and those help expand the rib cage. Okay. You also have some other muscles that are active. You have when inspiration is deep or forced. You have your internal intercostals. Those are also associated with your ribs, pectoralis, your chest muscles, sternocleidomastoid, and other back scalene, and then other back muscles, erector spinae going down your back, right by your spinal cord. It can all help you really breathe in deeply. Unlike inspiration, expiration is mostly passive, and some people don't realize this. This is a key note. It takes a bunch of muscles to breathe in, but really breathing out is mainly just relaxing. Breathe in, all these muscles are flexed. When you breathe out, you're just relaxing those muscles, right? All right, so diaphragm returns to its original shape, so it pushes up. So when you breathe in, your diaphragm flattens. When you breathe out, your diaphragm, when it relaxes, it pushes up, therefore pushing up on the lungs, therefore decreasing your lung capacity. That happens when you breathe out and when you relax the muscles in your intercostals, your chest, your rib cage decreases in size, and it compresses your lungs and you breathe out. Okay. And this is a diagram just showing that. There are some muscles that you can use for expiration, for forceful expiration. If you want to forcefully breathe out, like if you were yelling, or if you were, at the Eagles game and you were super excited, get those guys. All right, you would forcefully breathe out. Your internal intercostals and some of your abdominal muscles can help you with that, to forcefully breathe out. There is this term I highlighted here, the Heimlich maneuver. Some of you may be familiar with this if you are trained in first aid and CPR. What they do is, they put the hand here and breathe and sort of thrust up, push up on the diaphragm. What is this? What is this doing? When the diaphragm is relaxed, it's up already, and you're like thrusting it up further. Basically, you're compressing the lungs even more. What has happened when somebody's choking is that something is caught in their airways. And so what you're trying to do when you do the Heimlich maneuver is you're actually trying to further compress, violently compress the lungs even further, and therefore blow air up and out of the lungs, and that air pressure on whatever's stuck in their throat will blow it out. That's the idea. I have used this before to save my child's life, and I will say it is very, very useful. If you have children, I recommend being CPR and first aid certified and trained, because you never know when you will have to use something like this. And I was glad I knew it when it came time to use it. My 2-year-old son at the time had swallowed a grape tomato. I think he thought it was candy, and he swallowed it, and I turned around. He could not make any noise because he was choking, and his eyes were staring at me in fear. And I performed the baby Heimlich, which is you flip them over and you hit them on the back. And it's the same idea. You're compressing their ribs, most of their rib cage. You're compressing it very violently, and it forced the grape tomato out of his mouth. And he started crying afterwards, and I hugged him, and I almost started crying. Just because, how scared he was. I had never seen my son that frightened, but when you can't breathe, yeah, that's a bad feeling. I could only imagine how he felt at that moment. So that's basically the idea of the Heimlich. All right. And then we have some, and this slide is sort of just some non-respiratory movements. Not really intended for ventilation. All right, so you have sighs, yawns. I just wanted to touch base really quick on a sneeze, a deep inspiration, followed by a forceful expiration through the nose. And you notice that the velocity of the air is about 100 miles per hour, and that can basically, usually when the nose is irritated, something has irritated the nose and your body's trying to get it out. And a cough can be even higher velocity. And it's basically, usually it's trying to clear the larynx, the trachea, or the lower airways. We cough things up or cough it out. All right. But generally, this is the big picture of your ventilation, just showing you how the differences in pressures as well as the muscles involved. All right, now we want to also, it makes sense to talk about some of the factors influencing pulmonary ventilation. We want to touch on. Those factors are airway resistance, alveolar surface tension, and pulmonary compliance. All right, so airway resistance is determined by a couple things, but largely airway diameter. If you decrease the amount of space, just think of breathing through a stirrer straw versus breathing through a regular straw. Regular straw might be like this big, and you breathe through it and it's fine. But you ever tried to breathe through one of the little stirrer straws, like they use it to stir up your coffee or whatever? It's much harder to breathe through or to suck something up through. So The the diameter, the distance across the surface of the airway is a huge factor in determining the resistance. So resistance decreases slightly during inspiration as airways are pulled open as lungs expand. So that would decrease the resistance. So the bigger straw, decrease resistance. It's easier for air to go in and out of. Resistance increases, harder for something to move through it as the lungs recoil and the airways narrow. Okay. So big airways, easy for air to get in and out. Smaller air, the smaller the airway gets, the more difficult it is for air to move in and out, the more resistance you have. And that's going to be important, especially when we talk about diseases, pulmonary diseases, because anything that would reduce the amount of reduce or inflame or block your airways, would cause it to narrow your airways, would cause problems. The diameter of your bronchioles is controlled by smooth muscle. Remember, when we're in the trachea, we have those cartilage shaped like C's, and then as you get down to once you get down to the bronchus and then the bronchioles, once you get down to the bronchioles, the cartilage is gone, and it's more so just smooth muscle controlling, so they very much can control the size of the airways. So relaxation, bronchodilation, getting bigger, very similar to when we talked about this with the blood vessels. Increases that bronchodilation, increases the diameter, decreases air resistance, increases airflow, and the reverse is also the same. Contraction, those smooth muscles around of the bronchioles contract, reduces the airways, increases airway resistance, decreases airflow. Hopefully that makes sense. Another, and this is sometimes a little bit tricky for people for students to understand, alveolar surface tension, which is another factor. And the idea here is just that we want the alveoli to stay inflated, basically somewhat inflated at all times. We never want them to completely collapse, just like we never want the lungs to completely collapse. Okay. We want those alveoli to be inflated because we always want gas exchange to be happening at the surface between the alveoli and the capillaries that are very nearby, the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So that's just the idea. But the concept that we need to understand is this alveolar surface tension. The alveoli are covered with this thin film of liquid, which is mainly water. This gas-water boundary exists within the alveolus, where water molecules form hydrogen bonds due to their partial charges. Gases are nonpolar, therefore do not form hydrogen bonds. This creates, creating surface tension at the gas-water boundary. And this is greatest when the alveoli are at their smallest diameter, which is during expiration, when you breathe out. Right? But you have this surfactant produced by type 2 alveolar cells, which is a liquid film coating the cells of the alveolus, and this opposes the surface tension, because that surface tension created by the water and the gas and the alveoli would eventually cause it, when you breathe out, it would cause the alveoli to collapse. We don't want that. We want them to always stay a little bit inflated. So we have this surfactant, which is made by type 2 alveolar cells, and therefore keeps the alveoli, your air bags, from completely collapsing. All right, so this is very important. So it reduces, it disrupts water's ability to hydrogen bond with itself, and reduces surface tension, allows the alveolus to remain partially open. All right, and this is a diagram showing you that. So surface tension plays a role in influencing your pulmonary ventilation, right? So you have to have this surfactant to keep your alveoli from your alveolus from completely deflating, and therefore keeping them so yes, the surfactant is very necessary. The other thing is, the last factor is pulmonary compliance. So we have, the diameter of the bronchioles. We have the ability of the alveolus to stay open, stay slightly inflated, surfactant. We also have pulmonary compliance, which can be determined by a couple different factors, which affect gas exchange and the ability of lungs and the chest wall to stretch. So the degree of alveolar surface tension, which is the increased surface tension, resists the ability of the alveolus to inflate. So anything that would resist the alveolus inflation, that could affect your pulmonary compliance. Distensibility of elastic tissue. If your lungs can't stretch to inflate, that can change as if you have a lung disease. If you your lungs won't be as flexible to be able to like stretch, and they have to be able to increase volume, decrease volume. Also, your ability of your chest wall to move. Obviously, if you have something weighing on your chest, like if I were to stand on your chest, your ability to breathe would be very much affected. You feel like, I can't breathe, you're on me. This is why they tell you not to sleep with newborn babies in your bed, because if you roll over on that newborn baby, you can effectively suffocate that baby, because even if you're not covering that baby's face, just laying on that baby, for instance, their chest can't expand in the necessary amount to breathe. And so they could suffocate just from the pressure you put on their chest, and not allowing their lungs to be able to expand, because they can't expand their chest. All right. So this can all affect your ability to breathe. Now let's go into pulmonary volumes. And you saw this, if you have done the lab, you probably saw this already in the lab. If you haven't done the lab, you're going to see this in the lab. But pulmonary volumes, and these can also get a little bit confusing, but they make a lot of sense if you sit back and think about it. All right, so there's 3 volumes that can be measured using the spirometer. Spirometer produces a graph that records normal and forced inhalation and exhalation. And these are just useful tools. If somebody were to come in with some type of compromised pulmonary system, or a belief that there is a compromise to their pulmonary system, we would test these. Tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume. All right, so tidal volume, that's probably the easiest to understand. It's the amount of air you inspire or expire during normal quiet ventilation. Now, notice we're going to make a difference between normal and forced. All right, normal is what you're doing when you're just sitting here. Now, if I force it, I can breathe out more, or if I force it, I can breathe in more, right? We'll talk about those in a second. But when we talk about normal breathing in and out, how much air comes out, how much air comes in, it's about 500 milliliters in healthy adults. Okay, so your minute volume is if it's 500 milliliters per breath and you get 12 breaths a minute, it's about 6 liters per minute. All right, that's your minute volume. Okay, only 350 milliliters, this is an important note to make, only 350 milliliters of your total volume is available for gas exchange. All right, so out of the 500, only 350 is actually available to be exchanged at the capillaries. The remaining 150 is considered dead space. Air that never makes it to the respiratory zone, stays in the conducting zone, okay? Just to give you an idea of what's going on. All right, now is where it can get a little bit confusing, okay? Stay with me though. So we have the alveolar ventilation rate, volume of air that actually reaches the alveoli multiplied by the number of breaths per minute. So that's, if we know that only 350 milliliters reaches the alveoli, and multiply that times 12 breaths per minute on average, that's about 4.2 liters per minute, right? Actually reaches the alveolar, okay? So that's alveolar ventilation rate. Then we have inspiratory reserve volume, volume of air that can be forcibly inspired, right? So if we breathe in normally and then we force more air in, that's inspiratory reserve volume, volume of air that can be forcibly inspired after normal tidal volume. That's an average of 2,100 to 3,300 milliliters. And then you have the same thing going the opposite direction. Expiratory reserve volume, which is about 700 to 1,200 milliliters. After I breathe out normally, if I want to force more air out, that's expiratory reserve volume. And that, you see that number is less. That's 700 to 1,200 milliliters of air. The difference is your lungs stay inflated. So there's always some air left in your lung. You cannot, unless your lungs are, deflate because of something, because they're punctured or something, or the intrapleural pressure equals the atmospheric pressure for a bad reason, unless they completely deflate that way, which will cause you to have some serious issues. There always will remain some air in your lungs, right? You can't breathe all the air out of your lungs normally. So there is that leftover. So that's called the residual volume, which is due to, like I said, intrapleural pressure. All right, so we have tidal volume, IRV, the extra air you can breathe out, ERV, the air that can be, tidal volume, the air, normal air in and out, IRV, forcibly inspired, so the extra air you could breathe in, ERV, the extra air you can breathe out, and then residual volume, the air that's left over in your lungs. Then we can put all those together in equations, okay? So the inspiratory capacity, total amount of air that a person can inspire after after tidal volume is tidal volume plus the IRV. So that's your inspiratory capacity. So basically all the air that you could potentially breathe in. Functional residual volume, amount of air that is normally left in your lungs after tidal expiration. Your normal expiration is your ERV plus your residual volume. You can figure out how much air is left in your lungs. Your vital capacity is just your total amount of air that can move in or out of lungs. Your tidal volume plus your inspiratory, your expiratory. So the amount of air you normally breathe in and out plus the amount of air you can force in and the amount of air you can force out, that's your vital capacity. And then you have forced vital capacity as well, measured in the lab. And then we have total lung capacity, right? This is the sum of all your pulmonary volumes. So total lung capacity would be the amount of air I can normally breathe in and out, tidal volume, your IRV, the amount of air you can, and IRV and ERV, the amount of air you can forcibly breathe in and forcibly breathe out, plus your reserve volume, the amount of air left in your lungs, that's your total lung capacity. So these are just ways we can take these different pulmonary volumes and we've come up with different ways of calculating different equations and and you can compare what someone can do versus what maybe they're supposed to do. All right. And so if we see differences in some of these numbers, we can tell if something is wrong. All right. And then, so we will go over this in lab. If you don't get it by looking at it in these charts, we will go over it in lab as well. Okay. Now, for gas exchange, things also get a little bit interesting. Because with gas exchange, we're thinking about two different things, right? So two processes: pulmonary. So when we breathe in and breathe out, we're thinking of the oxygen going to the blood, the oxygen in the lungs going to the blood, and the carbon dioxide in the blood going to the lungs. That's pulmonary gas exchange. But we also have tissue gas exchange, which is the oxygen in the blood going to the tissues, the carbon dioxide in the tissues going to the blood, right? Two major forms of gas exchange. And unfortunately, well, fortunately to some, maybe unfortunately to some, we have some other formulas that we need to talk about. And this is going to be, so we talked about Boyle's law before: decrease volume, increase pressure, increase volume, decrease pressure, Boyle's law. Now we need to talk about Dalton's and Henry's law, right? So Dalton's law is the law of partial pressures, right? So move my picture out of the way. Basically, the partial pressures means that if you add up the pressures of each gas, you get the total pressure. So in the atmospheric pressure we already talked about was 760 millimeters of mercury. That's the pressure of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, all the gases that we breathe in and out. And if you add up the pressure of nitrogen in the air, the pressure of oxygen in the air, if you add up all these pressures, you eventually get to the total pressure of atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level, right? So that's all Dalton's law is. Dalton's law of partial pressures. You add up the individual pressures of the individual gases, and you get the total pressure. Partial pressures of a gas in a mixture determines where gas diffuses, okay? Remember, so we know that gas goes from high pressure to low pressure. So if I have high pressure of oxygen outside and I have a low pressure of oxygen inside, gas is going to move inside, all right? Start thinking along those lines. All right, so Dalton talks about partial pressures adding up to equal total pressure. Henry's law is the degree to which gas dissolves in a liquid is proportional to both partial pressure, which we just talked about, and its solubility in a liquid, right? So this is where it can get a little confusing, right? So nitrogen, high partial pressure. You saw nitrogen on this slide. 78% of the pressure of the total atmospheric pressure. So it's total atmospheric pressure 760. 78% of that pressure is nitrogen. So it's 593 millimeters of mercury, right? High partial pressure in air, 78%, but there's only a little nitrogen in your blood plasma because solubility in water is very low. Remember your blood plasma, the plasma, we're not talking about the erythrocytes, we're talking specifically about blood plasma, is primarily made up of water, right? Oxygen, lower partial pressure. Oxygen is, notice here, only 21% of the air we breathe, 160 millimeters of mercury, the pressure. Lower partial pressure in air than nitrogen, but dissolved in blood plasma, it dissolves in blood plasma because it's more soluble. So Henry's law says it depends on your partial pressure and your solubility. So the amount of gas that dissolves in a liquid is not only dependent on the partial pressure of the gas, but that comes into contact with that liquid, but also the solubility of that gas. So both of those play a role, right? So it's a higher so oxygen has a higher solubility in blood plasma, and specifically in water. And then carbon dioxide has the lowest partial pressure, only 1%, but it dissolves in your blood plasma as because its ability to dissolve in water is 20 times greater than oxygen. Okay. All right, so let's explain pulmonary gas exchange. Right, pulmonary gas exchange, external respiration, we call it, diffusion of gases between the alveoli, between the air sacs in your lungs and your blood. Remember, these air sacs are right next to blood vessels, connected to blood vessels. Oxygen diffuses from air into alveoli, into blood, and pulmonary capillaries, while carbon dioxide goes the opposite direction, right? So we breathe in, oxygen comes into our lungs, that oxygen diffuses into our blood, carbon dioxide in our blood diffuses into our lungs, we breathe out carbon dioxide, and that oxygen in our blood goes to our tissues, right? So converts oxygen poor, carbon dioxide rich blood delivered to lungs into oxygen rich blood with less carbon dioxide. As with movement of all gases, pulmonary gas exchange is driven by pressure gradients, blood, created by difference in partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? So blood has a low partial pressure. That's this, you see this term, this PO2, that's the partial pressure of oxygen. Remember, oxygen floats around as O2, not just as an O. Floats around as O2, that's a more stable form. If you remember that from, probably from bio, from part 1 of this class, also from if you've taken chemistry. So blood has a low PO2, partial pressure of oxygen, 40 millimeters of mercury. Notice that's even lower than air. Remember, in the air, it's 160 millimeters of mercury, so it's even lower. Remember, gases flow from high pressure to low pressure. So blood has a low partial pressure of oxygen, while the PO2 in air is 104 millimeters of mercury. Pressure gradient favors diffusion of oxygen into the blood. Pressure gradient that favors diffusion of carbon dioxide from capillary blood, 45 millimeters of mercury, into alveoli air, 40 milliliters. So carbon dioxide has a higher pressure in the blood, lower pressure in the alveoli, right? It's not as steep, but it is aided by carbon dioxide's relatively high water solubility, okay? So oxygen flows in, carbon dioxide flows out. And this is just showing you that. There is a term called hyperbaric chambers. And some of you, if you're an Eagles fan, hopefully all of you are Eagles fans, but if you're not, if right now, well, the idea of a hyperbaric chamber is that if you remember Terrell Owens, the famous Philadelphia Eagle, I think he tore something, Achilles or something like that. I forget what it was. And he was on like the radio being interviewed, and he said, I'm sleeping in a hyperbaric chamber. I'm trying to get back on the field for the Super Bowl. The year the Eagles went to the Super Bowl in like 2004, but they lost. And you may have heard that and not known what they were talking about. The whole idea was that when in a hyperbaric chamber, you have increased oxygen. So you have higher oxygen levels, higher oxygen pressure than you do in your normal atmosphere. So therefore, what happens is with higher oxygen pressure, more oxygen gets into your bloodstream. More oxygen gets into your bloodstream, your body actually heals faster. Because remember, your cells use oxygen constantly. If I give them more oxygen, they can do, the idea is they can do more or do it more efficiently, and therefore they would heal faster. So it's used for different types of people who have severe blood loss, crash, some different injuries. If you're anemic and you have less blood carrying capacity, they try to increase your oxygen levels. This is one way we can increase your oxygen levels. All right, so basically that's what hyperbaric oxygen therapy is. We give you higher than normal partial pressure of oxygen. So it's like a chamber where we put more oxygen than you would normally get. All right, some factors affecting the efficiency of pulmonary gas exchange. These are, so not only there are factors that affect pulmonary ventilation, but there are factors that can affect your ability for your gas to exchange. Number one is surface area. That we want that alveoli, the alveolus, to stay inflated. It's a big, sort of, it's not big, but it's a circle, so it has a lot of surface area. Well, not a circle, a sphere, so it has a lot of surface area. That surface area, allows for it to have plenty of room to exchange gas with the capillaries around it. So any factor that reduces surface area would decrease the efficiency of your pulmonary gas exchange. If that impairs, it's called, so low hypoxemia, low blood oxygen level, and then you also have hypercapnia, high blood carbon dioxide level. So if you have a reduced amount of surface area, you can have a reduced amount of blood oxygen getting in or carbon dioxide getting out. So both of those are if we notice either one of those, that's problematic, right? So there's also the thickness of your respiratory membrane. So remember, we have the alveolus, another basal membrane, and then we have the wall of the capillary, right? Those membranes combined are very thin, but anything that increases the size of the membranes increases the distance the oxygen has to go to get to the blood, and the carbon dioxide has to go to get to the lungs. So if there's inflammation, if there's anything, illness, anything that is increasing that distance, it can cause some serious problems. All right, because it can cause the gas to take more time to diffuse across the surface. Therefore, you're getting less gas, less oxygen in, less carbon dioxide out. Ventilation, perfusion, matching. The degree of match between the amount of air reaching the alveoli and the amount of blood flow, perfusion. Two phenomena help maintain what we call coupling, right? So changes in the alveolar ventilation lead to changes in perfusion, okay? So blood flow is directed to the areas with most oxygen. So when you breathe in the alveoli with the oxygen, blood flow is directed to that area. And then also changes in the efficiency of perfusion lead to changes in the amount of ventilation. Airflow is directed to the areas with the most blood flow. So your body sort of couples, it works together to maximize oxygen getting into your blood and the carbon dioxide getting out. Right? And so these are the factors which affect the efficiency of your gas exchange. Okay, gas exchange. We also have tissue gas exchange. This is going to be very important, which is internal. We call it internal respiration. Right? Oxygen going to the tissues, carbon dioxide coming out of the tissues. The cells use oxygen constantly for cellular respiration. So your partial pressure of your oxygen in your tissues and tissue is low because they're using up oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in tissues is low, while the pressure in your capillaries is high of oxygen. So oxygen diffuses into the tissue. Gas goes from high pressure to low pressure. Tissues produce a lot of carbon dioxide, waste product of cellular respiration. So partial pressure is high, whereas the blood flowing, the oxygenated blood has a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So oxygen from the tissue, carbon dioxide from the tissues is going to naturally flow by diffusion into your bloodstream. All right, pressure gradient and carbon dioxide solubility in water favors diffusion of this gas from tissue into systemic capillaries. All right, so that's what's happening in tissue gas exchange, which hopefully makes sense. Some factors affecting your tissue gas exchange: surface area available for gas exchange. Are there enough capillaries? They need to be large enough to allow for the gas to exchange in the tissues. The distance over which diffusion must occur. Less distance to diffuse results in more efficient gas exchange, just like we talked about at the lungs, same thing at the tissues. We want that oxygen to not have to go far to get to the tissues, and the carbon dioxide to not have to go far to get into the bloodstream. And the perfusion of the tissues. The more blood supplied to that tissue, the more capillaries, the more blood supplied to that tissue, the more likely oxygen can get to that tissue and carbon dioxide can be pulled away.